and gentlemen, very good afternoon to you all. It's a pleasure to see you here. Thank you for coming. My remarks, I think, will be relatively brief. There's a lot of detail in this, huge amount of detail. So looking at it, I'd say probably three elements that I would emphasize that are familiar to you. And they would be, I suppose, they're very familiar, so there is some consistency for once in this world, in this area. They would be volume, Asia, China. So volume, we continue to see increases in the volume of intellectual property applications worldwide that is higher than you might expect if you were to go on the basis of increases in world GDP. So the growth from 2017 to 2018, I should have said at the outset, we are measuring worldwide activity in the year 2018. For patents was, what you've got in the press release, 5.2%. For trademarks on the way in which we measure them there, 15.5%. For designs on the way in which we measure them there, 5.7%. Plant variety applications, 8.9%. So these are high growth rates when you look at growth rates for the economy in general. And this is the continuation of a story that we have seen now for several years, at least. And it leads to all sorts of questions from the policy point of view and from the administration point of view. The numbers now are very high: 3.3 million patent applications, 14 million trademark applications, 1.3 million design or design class applications, and so on. So these numbers are very high. And from the point of view of intellectual property administrations or governments around the world, the question is how to assure quality in the titles that emerge from the application process. And there, of course, everyone is interested in that you do not grant property rights on trivial applications, that we don't encumber the public domain with triviality. I think the answers lie in either the increasing use of artificial intelligence applications in various parts of the process of processing of intellectual property applications, and in cooperation, international cooperation, because many of these applications are the same underlying invention or mark filed in multiple countries. So obviously cooperation has a role to play. So I think that's point number one, really, and we can go into it further. Number two, again, somewhat similar, it's Asia and the fact that it's now increasingly the global hub for intellectual property applications. So we see roughly two-thirds, and we can look at the precise figures, but roughly two-thirds of all intellectual property applications are being filed in Asia, in Asian offices, IP offices. So this is quite, significant. We've spoken about it before, of course, on many occasions, but we somehow need to seize the reality. It's a very important development worldwide. And the precise figures we can give you, I think it's 66.8% for patents, 70% for trademarks, 69.7% for industrial designs, and a growing amount, 39.4% of plant variety applications. Now, in that, of course, China has been a major driving force, and the volume, of applications coming out of China or going into China, the volume of applications in the Chinese office is really quite extraordinary. 1.54 million patent applications in 2018. That's 46.4% of the global total. Now, they're not all applications originating from Chinese enterprises or nationals. Then the numbers filed in the Chinese office, so it includes filings by foreigners. But whatever way you look at it, either there's an enormous, and we can break down, correct me if I say anything wrong, you're all reaching for your books, like, just check that one. So whatever way you look at it, either the volume of applications coming from Chinese enterprises and individuals and government institutions, or the interest in having patent protection in the Chinese market for foreigners. Either way, it's a very, very significant thing. We can go through the figures for the other intellectual property rights if you like, but we can leave that for the discussion. But the figures, once again are quite exceptional in relation to China in its numbers of intellectual property applications. Just one point, the US remains the biggest internationalizer of its application base, if I can put it that way. So what I mean by that, well, it remains the country which is seeking the greatest amount of foreign protection for the applications originating with American enterprises or individuals. Okay, so if you look at the patent area, US-based applicants filed 230,000 patent applications overseas, abroad, outside the country. That's about 3.5 times as many as applicants from China filed outside China. Okay, so US about 230,000, sorry. Chinese enterprises, nationals, 66,000 outside China. So this is an interesting, this is not new. It's been the case for as long as we can, I think, remember in our records. And it's similar in trademarks and industrial designs. So that still remains, an important measure of reach, if you like, of your applications globally. So look, that's all I'm going to say, but Carsten, would you like to?
Thank you, Director General. I mean, maybe just two observations, things that struck me when I looked at the numbers. One, on China, I always like to look at the number of intellectual property filings in China in relation to the country's population and gross domestic product, simply to make things more comparable across countries. Of course, China is the biggest country in the world population-wise. It's, I believe, the second biggest economy in the world, and you would expect absolute numbers in China to be higher. It is interesting to observe, though, that in the case of patents, China is still at a level that is below the Republic of Korea. It's close to Japan. So if you were to take the Chinese numbers with an East Asian perspective, they look pretty much in line with what we have seen in other East Asian countries, with a notable difference, of course, that China is still a middle-income country, whereas the Republic of Korea and Japan are high-income countries. So I think in the case of patents, that's something that I'd usually like to point out. And maybe a second thing, looking at the list of countries that has seen strong growth in 2018, and really across the board, across patents, trademarks, and industrial designs, I thought India's performance again, struck out. And of course, if you compare India to China, the absolute numbers are significantly lower in the case of India. But I think in the case of India, over the last two years or so, we seem to have seen quite a considerable pickup in IP filings, and given the size of the Indian economy, I think that's noteworthy. And we have also seen this in the utilization rates of Indian applicants under the WIPO filing systems, in particular the Patent Cooperation Treaty system. So just these two additional observations.
Thank you. Questions? Yes, Efe.
Antonio Broto from F Spanish News Agency. I don't know if you can comment a little on my country, on Spain. If the trend there is the numbers of patent applications are going up or down, and also I see that in the gender gap is one of the highest countries with women filing applications, but still the number is only 24%. I don't know if you can comment a little on this gender gap, not only for Spain, but
in general. Yeah. Carsten, you might like to take that. You want to take that?
Listen, I don't think, from the cuff I could give you a detailed analysis of the Spanish figures, but we can look into this and get back to you.
Spain is just going down.
Yeah. Also, what is important to remember for the European countries, you have to look, we present the filings here by office, so you would see the figures here for the Spanish office. Spanish residents would also file at the regional level in the case of patents at the European Patent Office, in the case of trademarks at the European Union Intellectual Property Office. In the case of trademarks, we do see an increase of 2.4%. At the national office. In the case of the European Intellectual Property Office, we only, sort of have the number for the EU as a whole, and we see a significant increase of 5.8%. I think we would also be able to break this down by origin and tell you, the percentage change for Spanish origin applications at the EU IPO. I think on the gender statistics, I think you said, and I believe that's also my recollection, that if you compare Spain to other European countries, Spain shows somewhat higher shares of women participation, but it is still obviously far below, let's say, the 50% threshold that we would consider parity. I think one important explanation there has to do with technological composition. So we know that certain technological fields, especially those associated with the biosciences, have higher shares of women inventors compared to the traditional mechanical engineering. And I think that's, for example, the main explanation why you have lower shares of women inventors in Germany compared to Spain, where the biosciences are relatively more pronounced in Spain's patent landscape. But of course, again, I think the numbers show that women are significantly underrepresented as inventors in the patent system.
Just, I think Carsten has given a very comprehensive, as comprehensive an answer as we can. I'd just add the comment generally that, I think Spain's a country that's extremely committed to the use of intellectual property in its innovation system and in the creative industries. A very dynamic, as you know, creative industries, and that's an occasion to say that we also measure some activity, an increasing amount of activity in the publishing industry in this report.
Peter.
Yes, another geographical question, but this time to Africa, South Africa. You think together you've got Africa, Latin America, Caribbean is posted on 8.4% in terms of trademark filings. What type of trademark filings are you getting in Africa? And if you look at the map, South Africa seems to be overwhelmingly the largest country filing.
Yeah. Well, to tell you what sort of we'd have to look in more deeply into the figures. We can do that. To tell you what sort of, unless anyone's got an immediate answer. And yes, South Africa. Well, it's the largest economy, and one would expect that it has a very major participation in this area. what else to say? Well, the trademark, about trademarks. Look, I always find it difficult to speak about Africa. It's 54 countries. You know, so you've got a huge number of different countries with different level to deal with, and I think it's easier to break it down into individual countries to look at.
I think with Stephanie then, Beth.
Yes, on China, you said there's an increase in countries seeking protection in the Chinese markets. Can you say anything about that growth?
I'm not sure that's correct, but we can check it. But what I said is that when you look at the overall Chinese figure, that reflects the numbers filed in the Chinese office by nationals, whether enterprises or natural persons,
Right.
and the numbers filed by foreigners into China. So whichever way you look at it, there's a lot of activity going on in China in this space. Now, whether foreign applications are rising or not, I don't know off the top. Am I saying?
Do you want to go?
Well, first of all, the breakdown, we have 1.5 million applications in China. Out of that, 90% is from Chinese applicants and 10% is from foreigners. Now, in terms of absolute numbers, I have to go back to the office and give you that absolute number. I think what is 10% of 1.5 million applications found in China. And I think the other way to look at it, going out of China, so I think that after you mentioned 66,000 went out of China to other countries, other jurisdictions in the world. And now that has increased. If you go back last year, it was roughly 60,000. So there was an increase in that. And we have observed that trend over the last couple of years that Chinese applicants finding more application out of it in other jurisdictions.
I don't know if you mentioned, you spoke about artificial intelligence, but do you have figures on what's the share of this kind of technology in the patent applications?
So, well, look, I think there are two questions, generally two sort of areas to explore. One is, and it's the one to which I referred, the use of artificial intelligence applications to assist in the processing of this huge volume. You know, if you have 3.3 million patent applications worldwide, etc. You know, these are huge numbers. And as an example that I think I may have given before, but let's say, and there are many examples you could think of, but let's say you are the owner of the Mercedes symbol, you know, and you're getting 12 million, is it, applications, class applications, coming in, new applications in trademarks. And all you want to do is to find out amongst those which ones, you know, might be similar to yours for the protection of your own symbol. And you can use any symbol you're talking about, right? So, or if you're an examiner sitting in an office trying to assess whether a new application for a figurative element resembles something that has been filed in the past. What's the number of, total number of trademarks in force? We had the figure there, I think it's 40 million, is it? 49 million trademarks registered around the world. You know, so it's extending the limits of our human capacity to be able to do with that. And we have developed, for example, our colleagues have developed an image search mechanism, application based on AI, which does it in a second. Volume is quite an interesting sort of relationship when you think about technology. You know, different technologies don't arise for no reason. They're rising in general to meet a need. In this case, the need is quite apparent. A different question is, what sort of intellectual property policy do we want to apply to artificial intelligence applications? And there we did a study of, you know, earlier this year, last year? This year, I think, of all artificial intelligence patent applications since the 1950s. And all scientific publications in the field of artificial intelligence since the 1950s. And that reveals a lot of interesting information about who is, leading in artificial intelligence IP applications, which technologies are moving, of course, machine learning and deep learning, and so on. So that's a slightly different approach to the question. We were looking there to lay an empirical basis for a policy discussion, which is going to involve many questions, such as, who is the author of an AI-generated music or piece of text, or invention, and what sort of an innovation policy we want to have in this regard, whether you can use copyrighted data to feed an algorithm, or whether that's an infringement of copyright. Many questions are arising, and in this respect we have started a process at WIPO. It started on the day before our assemblies with an open conversation, and it will be followed by, we'll publish in the month of November, a draft list of questions that we think are arising for IP policy. And it's open process, and it'll be open for observations by anyone, states, non-state actors, corporations, anyone, to try to help us formulate the policy questions that are arising in this area.
Any more questions?
Sorry, just to not belabor the point, but on China, could you say a little bit more about the sectors or the areas where China is seeking, either people or corporations or enterprises are seeking protection, recognition for their things? Are they playing the game a bit more, because there's been so much criticism about their lack of enforcement or their lack of respect?
First one's easy to answer than the second. So the first one, have you got the figures, Masayed, on which the technology areas for China?
If you look at in the report, you'll find on page 39, so it gives you applicant from China, 38 and 39, and that will give you the breakdown by countries, by areas that especially
Field of technology? 38, 39
page.
page.
38, page 39. So figure 27, 28. At the global level, you'll find the page 29, the biggest technological field of technology. Mostly digital communication, telecommunication, computer technology. Those are the areas where you have a lot of activities. So if you go on to page 41, you'll find for China, one of the biggest share is computer technology. They have 7.2% of that application in that area. So, there are a lot of details. If you go to that page, you'll find the information.
Now, on the second part of your question, I wouldn't take the question and answer it assuming that your question is right. Okay? So you assume they haven't been playing the game. And I think that's an open question, and I wouldn't make any assumptions about it. Of course, it's very difficult to make any comment on it because it's the subject of an immediate trade dispute. And we have to respect, the fact that those two parties are deeply involved in a negotiation to try to regulate what each other's perceptions of each other's behaviour. So I don't think I can make any further comment than that. But here what you see is that China is a big, if not the biggest, user of the IP system in the world. Now this is an interesting thing.
Hi, following up on that, Jamie. You mentioned triviality of some applications, right? I mean, do you have any sign that China is purposely, presumably a lot of those patent applications are coming from state-owned enterprises or people who work for state companies. So I'm just wondering, if you got any sense that there's a concerted effort to beef up the number of patent applications coming from them as a matter of prestige, possibly?
So I didn't mention triviality in respect of China.
No,
Right, yeah.
but I mean, you did mention triviality.
Of
in
course,
terms
I think
of
it's a
high
good-
volume, right?
In terms of high volume, absolutely. So I think that we have to here, I mean, this we call in patent circles the quality issue, the quality issue. So we're all concerned about that because you don't want to encumber the public space with property rights over trivial or inventions or innovations that do not deserve a property title. Yeah. And I think that volume is a challenge here. We have a lot of patent applications, and offices are getting a lot of patent applications. So now it's a subject of pretty constant discussion amongst our member states in various committees. What measures can be taken to improve quality. And there are in our patent cooperation treaty realm, there is a set of quality procedures that the international authorities have to conform to, and so on. So it's a fairly constant policy concern, but we should take note of the fact that the more you have in terms of applications, the more stressed everyone is, and the more they have to work, and so we are concerned about quality. But now, on the other part of your question, I don't have any indications whatsoever, that there is any artificiality about the numbers that we see.